Every modern attempt to move the saga forward without centering the Skywalkers paradoxically proves how dependent the narrative has become on their presence, because each effort to step away eventually doubles back, as if the story itself cannot maintain cohesion without re-establishing contact with that bloodline. Prequels, sequels, and side stories may begin with the language of expansion, new eras, new heroes, new political dynamics, but they inevitably tether themselves to Skywalker history, revealing that the franchise does not simply reference the family for nostalgia, it uses them as narrative scaffolding. When a story tries to stand independently, the absence of Skywalkers is felt not as freedom, but as instability, because the emotional grammar of Star Wars has been written around their choices for so long that removing them strips scenes of inherited meaning. The sequels illustrate this tension most clearly because they repeatedly announce a desire to move beyond legacy while simultaneously relying on legacy to generate emotional stakes, reintroducing Luke, Leia, and Ben not as optional elements, but as structural necessities. Even when new protagonists are positioned at the centre, their arcs are accelerated or validated through Skywalker contact, as if significance must be conferred rather than earned, reinforcing the idea that importance in this galaxy is not intrinsic, but inherited. The name Skywalker itself functions as narrative shorthand, compressing decades of thematic weight into a single word so that a single mention can evoke hope, failure, temptation, and redemption without requiring setup, a power no newly introduced concept is allowed to develop organically. This compression creates a feedback loop, where writers lean on the name because it works instantly, and audiences respond because they have been trained to, which in turn discourages the slow cultivation of new mythic centres that could eventually shoulder similar weight. As a result, the galaxy feels smaller the more the Skywalkers are emphasised, because every conflict begins to resemble a family dispute scaled up to cosmic proportions. Yet when they are removed entirely, the universe feels hollow, as though the story is missing its emotional bloodstream. This contradiction traps the franchise in a narrow corridor where expansion risks dilution and focus risks suffocation, and neither option fully satisfies because both are reactions to a dependency that was never consciously addressed. Star Wars cannot decide whether the Skywalkers are the cause of galactic suffering or its solution, portraying them simultaneously as the source of imbalance and the only ones capable of restoring balance, creating a cyclical narrative that feeds on its own mythology. Anakin destroys the Republic and redeems it. Luke inherits the failure and corrects it. Ben repeats the collapse and attempts atonement. And each iteration frames catastrophe as inevitable. Once a Skywalker exists, yet also frames salvation as impossible without one. This framing subtly absolves institutions of responsibility, reducing systemic collapse to personal tragedy, and recasts history as a series of emotional crises rather than political or cultural failures, narrowing the moral lens through which the galaxy is understood. The saga insists it is not about one family, yet every foundational event is filtered through that family's choices, making the claim ring hollow because stories reveal their priorities through consequence, not intention. When Star Wars attempts to introduce new eras unconnected to the Skywalkers, the audience response often exposes the depth of conditioning, with viewers instinctively searching for lineage links, hidden descendants, or symbolic replacements to re-establish familiar gravity. This is not audience failure, it is narrative training, the result of decades of storytelling that equated meaning with one bloodline so thoroughly that separation feels like amputation rather than evolution. The franchise now stands at an inflection point created by its own success, because the Skywalkers are both its greatest mythic achievement and its most limiting structural constraint, simultaneously iconic and obstructive. To truly grow beyond them would require redefining how importance is generated in the galaxy, shifting from inherited destiny to earned consequence, from bloodline potency to collective action, and from personal imbalance to systemic responsibility. Yet doing so would mean relinquishing the instant resonance that the Skywalker name provides, accepting slower narrative burn, and trusting audiences to recalibrate their emotional expectations after being taught for generations to look to one family for meaning. Until that recalibration occurs, every attempt to move on will continue to circle back, not because the Skywalkers must return, but because the saga has not yet learned how to function without the gravitational force it built everything around. Star Wars is not, in theory, about the Skywalkers, but in practice it has made them synonymous with narrative legitimacy. And undoing that equation is a challenge far more complex than simply introducing new characters or new timelines. The irony is that the franchise's desire to escape Skywalker dominance only highlights how deeply the name is embedded in its foundations, because every escape route has been constructed using Skywalker-shaped tools. Until the saga confronts that dependency directly, rather than oscillating between denial and reliance, it will remain caught between expansion and repetition, unable to fully let go and unable to truly move forward. The deeper issue revealed by this dependency is not simply narrative habit but philosophical confusion, because Star Wars has never fully resolved whether it believes history is shaped by individuals or by systems. And by anchoring consequence so tightly to the Skywalkers, it repeatedly answers that question without admitting it is doing so. Every time the galaxy rises or collapses in response to one family's emotional state, the saga reinforces a worldview where institutions are fragile, cultures are passive, and billions of lives exist primarily as context for the internal struggles of a few force-sensitive figures. This is why attempts to broaden the lens often feel superficial, because new senators, generals, smugglers, or rebels may populate the frame, but their actions rarely carry final authority unless a Skywalker is present to validate, enable, or undo them. Even revolutions are framed as incomplete without Skywalker involvement, as if collective action alone lacks the mythic legitimacy required to reshape history, turning mass movements into supporting mechanisms rather than primary engines of change. This framing gradually shrinks the galaxy not spatially, but morally, because it teaches that accountability flows upward toward bloodlines rather than outward across societies, absolving cultures, governments, and populations of sustained responsibility. When catastrophe strikes, the narrative instinctively searches for the Skywalker at fault or the Skywalker destined to fix it, rather than interrogating how corruption, fear, and complacency metastasize across entire civilizations. This is why the family oscillates between being framed as curse and cure, because the saga has tied imbalance so tightly to their existence that removing them threatens to collapse the explanatory structure entirely. If the Skywalkers are the problem, then the galaxy is a hostage to genetics, doomed to repeat cycles of suffering until the bloodline extinguishes itself. Yet if they are the solution, then no era can ever truly move on without resurrecting their influence in some form. The sequels embody this contradiction by attempting to close the Skywalker chapter while simultaneously leaning on it to resolve their conflicts, creating endings that gesture toward finality without achieving narrative independence. Even symbolic gestures meant to democratize hope, such as the idea that anyone can be force-sensitive, struggle to gain traction when the climactic weight still rests on inherited legacy rather than earned impact. New characters are introduced with compelling potential, yet their arcs are often truncated or redirected to serve as reflections of Skywalker themes, rather than origins of new thematic language, limiting their ability to redefine what Star Wars can emotionally prioritize. This results in a franchise that feels both repetitive and unfinished, cycling familiar beats while never fully resolving the underlying dependency that drives those repetitions. The irony is that Star Wars frequently articulates messages about letting go of the past, yet structurally it refuses to do so, repeatedly resurrecting old symbols, names, and conflicts as narrative life support. This is not merely nostalgia at work, but risk aversion, because the Skywalkers guarantee resonance, and resonance reduces uncertainty, allowing stories to shortcut emotional investment rather than cultivate it patiently over time. However, this shortcut carries a cost because reliance on inherited meaning prevents the saga from developing new mythic centers that could eventually stand alongside, rather than beneath, the original lineage. Mythologies endure not by repeating their founders indefinitely, but by allowing new figures to emerge whose stories are shaped by different pressures, values, and failures, expanding the moral vocabulary of the universe rather than remixing it. For Star Wars to truly evolve, it would need to redefine what balance means without anchoring it to one family's emotional equilibrium, reframing it instead as a dynamic state maintained through institutions, communities, and collective vigilance. Such a shift would demand stories where victories are partial, consequences persist beyond a single lifetime, and no individual carries the burden or privilege of cosmic correction alone. This would also require trusting audiences to adapt, to accept slower myth-making and less familiar emotional cues, something the franchise has historically hesitated to do despite its expansive ambitions. Until that trust is exercised, the Skywalkers will remain both indispensable and obstructive, their shadow stretching across every era, whether invoked directly or felt through absence. The saga's struggle is not about honouring or abandoning the Skywalkers, but about learning how to generate meaning without them, a skill it has never fully practiced despite repeatedly claiming the desire to do so. Each return to the name reaffirms its power, and each attempt to escape it without structural change reinforces the sense of hollowness that follows, deepening the cycle rather than breaking it. In this way, the Skywalkers become less a family within the galaxy and more a narrative dependency the franchise cannot yet metabolize, a foundational myth that has outgrown its original function but cannot be safely removed without rebuilding everything it supports. Star Wars stands at a crossroads not of timeline or canon but of philosophy, forced to choose between infinite expansion, anchored to one lineage, or true diversification that risks temporary disorientation in exchange for long-term vitality. Until that choice is made consciously rather than reactively, the galaxy will continue to feel simultaneously vast and constrained, rich in history yet narrow in consequence, forever orbiting the same name even as it claims to move beyond it.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.